First things first, I do not want to annoy anybody with this video. I know there are definitely people out there with fond memories of this game, and if you enjoyed this and you had good experiences, do not let me change that. Instead, I'd love to hear why in the comments section. But coming from somebody who grew up with Mortal Kombat and played MK vs DC right as it was new, there was definitely a rather large group of players and fans that just didn't enjoy the game that much, and sadly, myself included. Now, if this was your first ever Mortal Kombat game, or perhaps you played it as a kid and you have strong nostalgic ties to it and stuff like that, most of the time when you see Mortal Kombat fans speak of this game, it does usually result in some pretty harsh words. My goal today is to help educate you on what the reasons were for this, especially talking about the mechanics and features that made this game just kind of miss the mark for a lot of people, but also to mention the side of game that many people did enjoy, giving an overall opinion on why this game seems to be a love it or hate it kind of situation. Plenty of people have documented the development of this game. Matt McMuscles has a really good deep dive into the specifics of that. But for this video, I really want to highlight the actual game itself. Not what it was originally meant to be, not what it could have been, merely what we got, and the stuff that just didn't really do it for me. This is Mortal Kombat vs DC Universe, and why the game divides so many Mortal Kombat fans. So, let's start by talking about the absolute beginning, what this game actually is. MK vs DC is actually the final 3D era Mortal Kombat, and it released in November of 2008. Armageddon was the previous game with a release in 2006, and a Wii version having a later 2007 release. This was on, at the time, the next-gen systems, so it had a PlayStation 3 and a 360 release. I grew up with the 360 version, so no matter what MK was on the way, it was just nice to have a next-generation Mortal Kombat game regardless. As the title suggests, this is a crossover game with Mortal Kombat and the DC Universe. I know that's stating the obvious, but yeah, you had a split down the middle roster where some of the more notable MK characters are there, and the same is said for DC. It is a very safe roster, where honestly, I can't fault it too much. The roster has exactly who you'd expect in it. For a simple look at the modes, here's what we're dealing with. One thing this game did do well, and something that we would see all the way to now in Mortal Kombat 1, is a fully cinematic story. A chapter-based story mode where you're playing a different character each time as each chapter unfolds. It's a mixture of cutscenes and gameplay that's pretty seamlessly blended into each other as each new fight is about to begin. You can actually choose which story you want to play, as the MK story and the DC story is actually different. It mainly focuses on either universe's characters, but the general plot of what's happening is exactly the same. You simply see it from either side's perspective, but I do like the fact that you had an option. The TLDR of the story is that both Raiden and Superman defeat Shao Kahn and Darkseid at the same time. The way they do this in each of their universes will cause a rift, essentially, and instead of defeating these villains, it merges them together into Dark Khan, who is personally my least favorite boss in all of fighting games. Dark Khan, he does exactly what you expect, a combination of both bosses' moves, and visually, they've basically been put into a blender. I can't explain it any further than that because that's it, that's what the boss character is. This rift in the two universes causes a rage effect on our fighters, and this rage throughout the story is something that kind of tries to explain how certain characters can fight others. Realistically, let's be honest, Superman isn't losing a single Mortal Kombat character when it comes to fighting, but one of his weaknesses is supposedly magic, where this magic is a means for characters to fight others without it making no sense whatsoever. Now, I'm not a huge DC guy, right? So please be kind here. Perhaps you could better educate me in the comments on this one. I don't feel it's right to judge this specific plot about Rage because, look, I don't know how true to the comics it really is that it's even a viable thing. The story isn't the worst thing about the game to me because back then, It was really the first MK game to have the story in this format, and it's been that way ever since. It's cool seeing the characters like this. I mean, the costumes are really cool, and we get to see a little bit more voice acting for loads of characters. Not to mention, as I said, you get to choose either side, so it's 2 stories in one. I like that, and to be honest, this experience is one of the stronger elements about the game overall. Outside of that though, the modes are few. There are no mini-games like the 3D games before it, and there's really just a simple arcade mode. Now the thing about this is, you can choose how franchise-heavy the arcade ladder actually is. You can choose Mortal Kombat only, DC only, or a mixture. So there was an attempt here to allow you to prioritize which fighting game you want to experience more. The thing is, the 2 franchises are very, very separate to each other. I like and appreciate this idea. As a kid, I didn't have any interest in the DC side. I'm really sorry if that bothers anyone. But I just wanted to experience a new Mortal Kombat game, right? So doing arcade ladders with only MK characters did at least help that experience just a little bit. And I guess the same could have been said if you played this just for the DC side. It's the opposite effect for pretty much the same thing. Call me petty, but I only cared about Mortal Kombat, so I don't know, what else do you want from me? Another thing this game had, which I think looking back it's one of the more notable areas, is the combo trials. I made a whole video about the combo trials because some of them are actually pretty difficult, but this is actually something that I kind of wish existed more nowadays. Characters in something like MK1 do have combos, but a lot of them are very simple and just not all that challenging, whereas MK vs DC, some of these combos are genuinely like, you'll be stuck there for a while just trying to figure it out. But the challenge of just being given difficult combos that, even if they're not the most optimal and useful in a match, it's just nice to have this extra layer of challenge. When I look back on MKDC, clearing out some of these combo trials is a form of replay value, and the game did have trophies or achievements, depending on console, for completing all of these, and if you managed to clear every single character's trial, that was a pretty big accomplishment. Some characters are very difficult, to say the least. Speaking of Mortal Kombat though, this is where the most obvious issues were apparent: the teen rating. I think it's actually debatable that should this game come out today, there's a possibility it could have actually had the mature rating, but back then, not a chance. Understandably, the violence of Mortal Kombat just couldn't exist in a game with DC characters. So, the finishing moves and, well, basically everything else had to be toned down for the game to exist. This means that any finishing move you see is extremely tame, and in most cases just straight up underwhelming. It's so bad to the point of some finishing moves seeming really pointless. I think Kano has one of the most notorious here because it's literally just a throw animation, and other characters certainly aren't great either. Now, I've got to give credit where it's due, however. Some characters whose finishing moves involve other effects can be pretty okay and creative for the rating. Sub-Zero has some decent ones, even Lex Luthor has some pretty nasty ones for a teen rating, but the good ones are few and far between. The DC heroes do not perform finishing moves, instead it's heroic brutalities. I guess back then the idea of Superman brutally murdering somebody wasn't on the cards, who knew? But it's probably the biggest case of this game having to make compromises to blend the two universes together, and sadly not really satisfying either side, right? However, everything I've mentioned at this point is base level. It's the stuff you see and experience for the first time. The main content I want to cover in this video was actually the mechanics and the gameplay features, because that, to me, is where the biggest issues in the game actually lie, and personally makes it not a great experience to revisit, in my opinion, but this is where the divide applies, because some people genuinely look back on this game fondly, and that's totally fair enough. The main thing to point out is that MK vs DC is notorious for being quite broken. So the first thing I want to talk about is how the 3D movement was tackled. It is a 3D fighting game, just like the PS2 era Mortal Kombat, which means you can sidestep and generally move around the stage with more freedom than a standard 2D game. However, the way this was handled here makes it the hardest to control of the 4 3D titles by far. The game has a sidestep button, or I guess just a 3D movement button, right? You have to hold it down to sidestep in either direction. If you don't hold this button down, up and down are simply crouch and jump. I think the idea here was to give the player a bit more control over how they can jump around, as the 3D Mortal Kombats often do have jumps like this, and jumping is a part of the game's high-level play for this game. But ultimately, it just kind of results in a really clunky experience that's hard to get into, and even when you know what you're doing, can just feel really off to me. The same can be said with the forward movement, where if you tap forward, you can kind of walk really slowly, but there's also a run thing where you can run in quite fast. Add the sidestep button into that and the jumping, and I don't know, it just feels a bit counterintuitive for a 3D game. At least in the PlayStation 2 era games, the movement was self-explanatory. And a 3D fighting game needs that kind of movement that you don't have to think about, because with more movement direction, the easier it is to execute this movement, the better the game feels. I mean, growing up with something like Soul Calibur 2, for example, or I don't doubt many of you have played at least one Tekken before, you'll know what I'm talking about with that. The less you have to think about it, the more satisfying it is. It wasn't just the movement side of this button, though. There's actually a thing in this game where if you hold the sidestep button and perform a few normals, they actually have faster recovery. Most notably, the low pokes, like a down 1. And for those unaware of the notation system, that's a crouching punch. So having faster recovery on buttons like these, while it can help with a few combos and stuff, makes the game feel a little bit mashy to me. I don't know if this was intended, but the other 3D games had weird stuff like backdash cancelling in Deadly Alliance and Deception, or jumping back after things in Armageddon. This was simply a new entry into the list of strange recovery situations. The built-in mechanics, however, are a different story. Another thing that, to me, ultimately made the game feel a bit unsatisfying. Let's talk about stage transitions. There are a number of ways you can go from one part of a stage to the other. The most common is the one where you go down in level. Instead of an animation and a bit of damage to the opponent or something, similar to the earlier games, it activates a mini-game that both players have to partake in. Here, the player initiating the transition presses one of the 4 attack buttons. The defending player can press any of these buttons as well, and if the defender presses the same button, you'll flip them over and you'll be rewarded the damage when you land. This can happen as often as it can during the animation, and if you don't get the right button, damage is dealt and it leads to a higher damage cash out at the end of it. Something you can perform if enough hits have landed is a cash out animation, different for every character. I don't like this. I never liked this. A strange minigame which feels like a slightly upgraded rock, paper, scissors built into the game itself just isn't very satisfying. And although if you have lightning fast reactions, you might be able to react to the aggressor's button press, it's just a really strange and not great feeling feature. I wish I had another word for that. It takes a while too. It takes you out of the game and it kills any momentum you might have. Not to mention, some characters will actually prefer a wall situation for pressure or combos, and it's unfortunately very easy to accidentally activate one of these transition effects. This isn't the only one in the game, by the way. There is another one where it activates a test your might on certain stages, and it's self-explanatory. The player that mashes the hardest wins the exchange. And to be fair, it's not as long as the falling one, or at least it doesn't feel as long, but it's still something that takes me out of the match, and I'd rather it not exist. However, it's nice to keep that somewhat classic minigame built into a match. From like a gimmick standpoint, I kind of appreciate it. I just don't like the fact that it takes me out of a game the way it does. I understand why they would go for something new like this, because every Mortal Kombat tries new things, and this was, you could call, an evolution of the stage transitions. But thankfully, these kind of mini-games in a match haven't returned since. Speaking of mini-games, though, here come the throws. You have 2 throws in this game. One is a standard throw where you fling the opponent somewhere else on the stage, and it's often the better option, especially as there are certain ways you can interact with the environment to throw them into something to activate a full combo. The other throw, however, is a repeat version of the falling stage transition. The whole press the right button as your opponent does thing. There's a limit on how many successful hits the throw can lead to, but getting the right button one time as the defender will actually tech the throw and save you from the whole thing. This sequence is really slow, and it's one of my least favorite features. I suppose the thing here is that you don't actually have to go for this. I do personally think the other throw is better because it's more reliable in what it leads to. But it's just another example of something that happens in a match that takes me out of it. And again, this throw takes a long time as far as a throw is concerned. I'd say stick to the one that can throw them into the stage. Now, one of the biggest gameplay mechanics was the introduction of a meter system, often referred to as a rage meter in this game. It plays off the story, as you'd expect, but basically, you can build up to 2 bars of this during a match. It has 2 different options, and it's one of the main reasons that this game is described as pretty busted. It all comes down to what both of these options provide a player. The first feature is a combo breaker. Simple stuff, you'd think. MK vs DC certainly wasn't the first Mortal Kombat to have these. They started out with Deception, but unlike the 3D games before it, where the game gave you 3 of them at the start of a game to spend however you wish, 1 bar of Rage Meter would activate a combo breaker. The issue here is that combo breakers have a launch animation. They launch the opponent, and you can recover from your breaker in time to move before the opponent hits the ground in most cases, which means a full combo from a combo breaker was a more regular occurrence than you'd think, especially in high level, because top tier characters and their ability to combo from a breaker was one of the reasons they're strong to begin with. Someone like Shao Kahn, for example. Green Lantern is notorious for this, because any combo breaker he lands is a lift special into full combo, making hitting an opponent a massive risk. And from that point, I mean, what are you supposed to do? It was a pretty severe issue for some characters. The other mechanic is simply called Rage Mode. Rage has an almost burst-like animation when you activate it, but in this state, you're fully armored. But you're not just fully armored. Should you land attacks on block, after a few hits they become unblockable. And as you might expect, this results in some common scenarios where a purposeful combo drop into grounded hits to become unblockable again is a very viable strategy. The ultimate goal when the opponent has rage is don't get hit. You gotta run for your life the moment rage has been popped. I genuinely think when it comes to power-up stances in Mortal Kombat, rage mode is by far the strongest, the most broken of all of them. It is absurd. Another mechanic is pro moves. Instead of spending meter on enhanced special moves, something you'll expect nowadays, the game had what is called pro moves, an extended input on a special move to gain a bonus hit or a piece of utility, whatever really. The timing on these moves can be pretty strict, and it might take you some time to get comfortable. But honestly, I don't hate this feature. You don't spend meter on enhanced moves here, so having new moves at all is a welcome addition. And the pro moves just give you a different ender, whether it's repositioning, more safety, more damage, or perhaps even a combo extender at all. It results in MK vs DC being a bit more execution heavy than you'd think, and some of the combos in this game take a lot of execution when you're looking at high damage, and pro moves, in some cases multiple pro moves, is a big part of that. It's satisfying, it's pretty fun, and not something everyone's able to do, so there's a definite skill ceiling. However, an area of MK vs DC that was always poor, sadly, was the online play. The online itself was powered by GameSpy servers. Quite a few online games of that era used GameSpy, but for fighting games, or should I just say Mortal Kombat, it just wasn't very good. It's leftover stuff from the older 3D games too. Deception and Armageddon had the exact same online system, complete with the rooms and the various options. Now, it wasn't so bad in the PlayStation 2 era, where Deception and Armageddon did actually have online, if you'd believe it or not, including chess combat and motor combat, but that was like in the days online fighting games were nearly non-existent, if it's that or nothing, that was always going to be the preferred option. But in the days of the 360, the way online worked for Mortal Kombat just wasn't the one. Basically, it's gonna be hard to explain how it works because I promise you it's unlike any online you've ever experienced. You're essentially playing a separate version of the game when it comes to the meta. This was a thing in the PS2 era Mortal Kombats as well, and it's the exact same thing here. So, you didn't have any button delay, you had attack delay. As in, you'll use a move, and after a few frames or whatever, the move then becomes active. It's like the hitbox for the move becomes active after the animation has started, so the game is a little bit behind itself, but you haven't got any input delay to simulate that. What this meant is, moves hit differently to the offline play. Some combos do not work at all online, or opposite direction. Some combos are online only. Even Lex Luthor, who sucks in this game, had a combo loop against a wall, but only online, because the end of the move acted differently. I mean, moves being safer online, resulting in different strategies that would never work offline. There's a lot of stuff going, but here's the thing about all this. You may think this is absolutely terrible, but online was where 99% of the players actually were. You didn't have tons of people going offline and traveling all over to major events like we have today. The scene was mostly an online scene. Clan battles, the teams that players had between themselves, it was actually something that existed in the online MK space before this game. It started back in Deception, but a few years later on the 360 and the PS3, you'd have the same online culture of clans and clan battles. I personally think it was cool to see it exist. However, the online game was the game for most people, because it's where their PvP experience came from. The whole two different game thing wasn't as big of a deal as you'd think, because unless you regularly played offline and online equally, it didn't really mean a whole lot to you. And for the online community, where that's the only place they played, it's all they experienced, so I don't think it's really all that bad. But let's talk specifically about a few characters now. Not all of them, just a few to give you an idea over the competitive side of the game. Now, I definitely don't want to spend this section just complaining about characters, so I'm going to make sure to just state what characters are doing here. I'm not going to cover everyone, and it's not a total overview or anything, merely a short version of what some characters are saying in this game. Green Lantern and his breaker combos are one of the more known sides of the game to the greater community. So Green Lantern in general doesn't need much explaining. He's got plus frames, breaker utility, he's got some range to him as well. He's a fantastic character and he can break certain mechanics. It's worth mentioning that the top two of this game were always regarded as Green Lantern and the Flash. Now, the Flash is genuinely one of the fastest characters in the history of the franchise. Personally, I'd probably say the fastest. No surprises there, I mean, it is the Flash, but his dash attack was a supercharged version of Cabal's Nomad Dash, and this dash led to whiff punishes, combos, everything. Basically, it was really hard to deal with in the neutral because he can dash on a moment's notice. He is a terrifying character. And by the way, his spin also had an infinite attached to it, which was especially rough as the opponent can't really build a resource fast enough to break it. Now, you go back to some old Test Your Might forums, some people had even discussed maybe banning this character one day. It was that extreme, but honestly, it didn't seem like the game was active enough for those things to really develop. It's not like we had countless tournaments for this game where we could finally ban the Flash. I just don't think we reached that point. Speaking of infinites, this was a popular one online, Superman. This character had a full screen ground pound with a pro move attached to it. The pro move would give a second hit, but was plus enough on hit to guarantee another ground pound. It's dead simple, but this ground pound with the pro move on it is a true infinite back-to-back. If you ate a ground pound online, there's a high chance you've lost the round unless they mess up the input, and I'd still have nightmares. Now, some MK characters were really good as well. Sub-Zero was actually the strongest of the Mortal Kombat characters, as he had viable use of plus frames, good ways to build meter, and he could actually use the Rage mode combined with his freeze to obtain very high damage rage combos. He's a fairly defensive character, but he's got offensive options, and his rage does make him a real threat among other things too. He often sits around top 3 in a lot of tier lists. Scorpion's a really great character as well. Again, he has access to plus frames. It's pretty ideal, as some of his plus on block normals are things like a standing punch or a crouched low punch. Yeah, some of the low pokes in this game are plus on block. Can you imagine if we had that now? Anyway, he's got pressure from his plus frames, access to decent combos thanks to his confirmable spear. His Hellfire is just a really good move for guaranteed damage. And in an old Test Your Might thread by Tom Brady, who was one of the absolute authorities in this game, I noticed that his teleport punch is said to be really good for interrupting the opponent's frame traps. But sadly, a lot of those video examples are lost, so I can only demonstrate them as far as my own knowledge extends. My point here, though, is that broken stuff was fairly rampant. It was a part of the game's identity. So if you played this game at that level, you just understood that it was a huge part of the game to begin with. And this brings me on to the general community vibe. Because I know I've said a lot of things that I don't like about this game in the video, but I am at the end of the day simply one person. The reason I say that is this game has often divided the community, because there's definitely people that enjoyed it just as much as there were people that didn't. And the biggest part of that was understanding what the game is and accepting that that's just the way things are. I reached out to various community members, either modern or those that were around a long time ago, and there's various different talking points that I've been given. I've tried to put it all into this video as digestible as possible. The first thing to discuss about community is that you have to remember, MK vs DC may not have been the most ideal of Mortal Kombat games to release, especially seeing as there was supposedly that more gritty and dark Mortal Kombat that was going to come before this, or should I say instead of MKDC. But this was the game we have, and this was the game that released. It was on the next-gen systems. It had online play. It had really decent graphics for the time. It had gorgeous costumes for the Mortal Kombat characters. I can't really say the same for the DC characters because they looked exactly how they were seemingly supposed to, right? Superman looks like Superman. Wonder Woman looks like Wonder Woman. There's not much else they could have done back then, I'm sure, but the MK characters looked absolutely ridiculous, and some of the best designs they've ever had. But outside of just the visuals, you look at the fact that we have this Mortal Kombat that it's what we've got, and it can be played online, and you can figure it out. You can learn your favorite character. You can compete head-to-head against other players in either ranked matches or the lobbies, the clan battles that existed where you would be part of a different clan online and battle against other teams, whether you're using forums or anything else of the sort. All of this was because we did, at the end of the day, have a new Mortal Kombat. And whether it wasn't for everyone, you still had an option, which before this game was better than nothing because the last Mortal Kombat before it was Armageddon, a whole console behind. Now, the competitive scene wasn't particularly massive for this game. It seemed to be very forum-driven, and you can find various threads on things like Test Your Might about some upcoming events, whether it was online stuff or one of the more notable tournaments was an offline NEC. You can find a big VOD of that on Check's YouTube channel, who was an absolute combo legend in MKDC, with some of the most ridiculous combos you've ever seen, and actually continues to upload insane combos to this day. So definitely make sure you check out Check's YouTube channel. But it did bring forward some players that we would see do big things in MK9. Two players that come to mind are Tom Brady and Rio. Rio was really the kind of player that this game got a lot of people knowing who Rio was, who would eventually go on to be an absolute legend in MK9. In the earlier days of MKX, Rio was a massive threat. But let's not forget Tom Brady. Tom Brady's been one of the absolute original MK competitive players for as long as many people have been even watching MK, or whether they grew up with it, Brady was back then competing. Whereas a game like MKDC had the two players kind of be like figureheads of the scene, which going going into MK9, we would see a lot more of them. But for a lot of people on Test Your Might, this game is where some of us saw them for the first time. Now, when it comes to where this game could have gone in a competitive sense, it's really hard to tell, because the reality is, Mortal Kombat vs. DC came out near the end of 2008, and it wouldn't be long until Street Fighter IV released on home consoles. And the second Street Fighter IV came out, it was an absolute generational release. And dare I say, I fear that MKDC just wouldn't have had any opportunity to grow in the masses, because with the biggest game of the generation hitting its home release, this game sadly didn't have much of a chance. But there's always more stuff to discuss and there's always more to get into. However, I appreciate you for checking out this video. This game really does have a divide between players of some love it, some hate it. And I hope that watching today's video helped at least somewhat give an insight to things you might not have seen or heard of before. People often talk about MKDC vaguely. Even on this channel, it's pretty common knowledge that it's a game I'm not a huge fan of, but it's something that's rarely talked about, and I wanted to change that for this video. Thank you for watching. Stick around for more MK content to come, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.